Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the ancient mystery of Revelation 16:3, looking at exactly how early thinkers decoded its incredibly vivid apocalyptic text. We're talking about a passage that has fascinated, terrified, and honestly perplexed readers for nearly 2 millennia. Let's jump right in and see how 4 foundational historical scholars tackled one of the most intense visuals in the ancient world.
The second bowl was poured into the sea, and every living thing in the sea died. Now, this striking verse has puzzled scholars for centuries, with its terrifying imagery of water turning to blood. It's a moment of absolute cataclysm. I mean, just imagine standing on a shoreline and watching the ocean, the very source of life for much of the planet, suddenly become a literal sea of death.
But here's the ultimate question we've got to ask, and it's the exact same one those ancient commentators wrestled with. Is this a literal bloodbath, or is it a spiritual metaphor? To figure that out, we're going to explore how 4 distinct thinkers tried to crack this cipher, effectively splitting their interpretations into 2 very different camps.
Let's start with the first camp, literal blood in battles. This is the most visceral, surface-level reading of the text you can get, actual physical warfare.
Enter our first thinker, Oecumenius. He viewed the blood in the sea not as some magic trick falling from the sky, but as the literal, gruesome aftermath of massive, violent naval conflicts. He grounds this apocalyptic vision entirely in the very real horrors of human war.
Oecumenius breaks down the geography of the apocalypse in a really fascinating way. He believed the text pointed directly to military encampments situated right next to rivers and fleets totally destroying each other out on the water. For him, the blood in the sea represents the sheer, staggering volume of casualties from those naval battles. And when the text mentions rivers and streams turning to blood, well, he interprets that as the runoff from catastrophic land battles fought by armies encamped alongside those waters. It's a deeply practical, albeit incredibly horrifying, interpretation of the text.
Then we have another prominent scholar, Andrew of Caesarea, who also entertained this extremely literal lens. He envisioned catastrophic global clashes at the end of times, but he zoomed out to an even larger, more prophetic scale.
Let's look at how this scales into a global scenario. Andrew of Caesarea described a worldwide slaughter triggered when the prophesied forces of Gog and Magog actually move against each other across the 4 corners of the world. In this scenario, disobedient kings and their entire armies are completely annihilated. The sheer scale of the slaughter is so immense that the seas are physically defiled by the casualties of war, and the rivers literally mingle with the blood of the fallen. It is a terrifying picture of global military self-destruction.
But what if this terrifying vision isn't about physical war at all? Let's pivot and shift our lens entirely to our second camp, the spiritual sea. A scholar named Promasius threw a radically different idea into the mix, something he called a fleshly reading. He suggests that the bitter, salty sea mentioned in Revelation actually represents those who failed to interpret religious law spiritually. They just looked at the text in a purely literal, surface-level way. So to Promasius, the sea isn't a body of water at all, it's a bitter state of mind.
And this brilliantly illustrates the real danger of missing the deeper point. Promasius argued that a surface-level or fleshly reading caused people to miss the ultimate truth completely. By refusing to read spiritually, they ultimately failed to recognize Christ in the law. That bitter sea? It's the barrenness of a literal interpretation that totally lacks deeper spiritual insight.
Here is where it gets absolutely crucial, because it's all about the cascade of consequences this causes. This spiritual blindness, according to Promasius, leads to absolute disaster. Because they couldn't discern Christ in the law, it literally led them to crucify the Lord of glory. But it doesn't stop there. Burdened by this failure, they are led to actually desire the image of the beast. They willingly take on its mark and choose to worship the beast instead. So the death in the sea isn't about physical drowning, it is the spiritual death of choosing deception over truth. To back up this really profound metaphorical reading, Promasius brilliantly connects this second bowl of Revelation to something his readers would know like the back of their hand, the very first plague of Egypt, where the fresh water turned to blood.
He writes, "From the sterile waters they also moved to the filth of blood." Parmenius points out that just as the fresh waters of Egypt turned into undrinkable blood, those who rely on sterile, fleshly interpretations move right into the filth of blood themselves. The blood here represents the spiritual death of every living thing in the world. He makes the sharp observation that these are people characterized by a manifest sterility, those who, with enfeebled tongues, basically condemn themselves by saying, "His blood be on us and on our children."
Another foundational thinker, the scholar Bede, takes this metaphorical reading even further. He focuses specifically on the dynamics of persecution, taking a hard look at those who attack the church.
Bede argues that the blood in the sea is actually a form of spiritual revenge. He says that those who send waves of persecution against Christ's servants are living a massive lie. They boast in a worldly sense, thinking they are vibrant, powerful, and truly alive. But the spiritual reality is completely inverted. The blood represents the spiritual revenge enacted upon them, proving that while they boasted of life, they were actually serving the author of death all along.
Which brings us to a critical junction. Revealing divine power. So, why this terrifying display of divine wrath and blood at the end of days? What's the ultimate purpose of this apocalyptic imagery?
Well, Andrew of Caesarea, the scholar who earlier gave us the literal warfare interpretation, returns here with a really fascinating dual lens. He also offers a spiritual interpretation about using the Sea of Blood specifically to unmask deception.
He argues that the Creator uses prophets, specifically Enoch and Elijah, to turn the sea to blood for a very precise reason: to expose the Antichrist's weakness. By demonstrating absolute command over creation, divine power completely exposes the light-mindedness of those who are deceived by the beast. Seeing the very elements of creation arrayed against the destroyer does two incredibly important things. It strikes fear into the unstable, and it deeply, deeply strengthens the resolve of those who already have secure faith.
And to really drive this home, Andrew uses an incredible historical parallel. Just as God worked through Moses long ago to expose Pharaoh's hard-heartedness and demonstrate divine power in Egypt, the end times will feature Enoch and Elijah exposing the sheer fragility of the Antichrist. Its history repeating itself on a cosmic scale, proving the absolute weakness of those who choose to follow the destroyer.
All right, let's look at the final verdict. Let's see how these four foundational thinkers decoded this single cryptic verse and what we can take away from it today.
When we step back, we see a profound dichotomy in how to view apocalyptic texts. You've got Oecumenius looking purely at the visceral horror of literal war. You have Prometheus and Bede looking at the deep psychological horror of spiritual blindness and the massive consequences of persecution. And then you have Andrew of Caesarea bridging the gap, suggesting, hey, it could be both. It shows us that reading the text isn't just about what happens to the water out there, it's about what happens to the human soul in here.
Bede's haunting words really stick with you, don't they? Those who boasted that they are alive will be proved to have served the author of death. Man, it reminds us of the ultimate consequence of surface-level deception and persecution. It's a stark warning about the danger of false confidence when we are spiritually blind.
And that brings us to the application for us, right now. It leaves us with a critical thought to ponder long after this explainer ends. Think about Prometheus's interpretation of that sterile surface reading. How often do we miss the deeper, profound meaning of something because we're completely distracted by the literal blood in the water? When we consume information, are we stuck on the literal surface, or are we actively digging to find the deeper truth beneath?